So I've been asked to talk about U.S. housing policy, all of it, in 10 minutes, 15 minutes at most. So I was like, I can do this. And I did what most normal people do, particularly the students I work with at MIT. I went to ChatGPT, and I said, tell me about U.S. housing policy. It's really fun to play around with it, actually. Just quickly what ChatGPT came up with, the creation of the Federal Housing Administration in 1934, that created the idea of mortgage insurance, pretty important idea. The passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which we all know as the GI Bill in 1944, provided low-cost mortgages, job training programs, as we all know, increased home ownership, but it also created a lot of suburban development. That was kind of what it was designed to subsidize. There's also a lot of questions about how equitable it was in terms of race, but it certainly was a pivotal moment in U.S. housing policy. 1968, the passage of the Fair Housing Act that prohibited discriminatory practices in housing for the first time, really explicitly. Big deal. 1965, the creation of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and this is where I don't know why they flipped those two dates, but anyway, another big deal, the U.S. federal government says we're going to be involved in the housing market and not just in the mortgage market. In 2008, the Recovery Act, after what Governor Mills referred to as the Great Recession, which for some reason we call the Great Recession, really aimed to stabilize the housing market. And then finally, Dodd-Frank in 2010. I was marginally impressed with this list. I thought it was a good start, but ChatGPT isn't quite there yet. So I wanted to add to that list a little bit, and that's what I'm going to do now. First off, it didn't talk about zoning at all. And I think I have some theories about why. That's a much longer conversation, but so I'm here to at least, part of what I want to talk about is zoning, not surprisingly, given the event. And I think what I like to say about zoning is we're all worried about how to pay for housing. By fixing your zoning, you can actually help subsidize housing without actually costing you any money, because we are artificially constraining the market with zoning. And we're doing that for various reasons, some of which are good and some of which are fear and some of which maybe aren't so good. But by writing your zoning and making it to allow more housing, you're basically subsidizing the housing market for free. And I think that's lost a lot of the time in terms of sort of the market. It's not going to create the housing, but at least creates the platform for it. One of the reasons I like to start with one of these mortgage risk maps, we all have heard a lot about redlining and how certainly initially banks, when they started doing things like the GI Bill, said it's not good to to subsidize and to pay for mortgages in certain areas. And they picked areas of cities and towns, including ones in Maine, that they said, we don't want to give mortgages in these areas. These are high-risk areas, and they tended to color them in red, and that's where the term redlining came from. Those areas were often low income. They were often minority-owned areas. They were also often the areas that needed the investment the most in the first place. They had the worst housing stock. They had potential for more housing development. And the pattern was to say that you can't do this. You can't get mortgages in these areas. So there was definitely some efforts to fix that, certainly the bills that I mentioned. But at the same time as banks and the financial markets were worried about this, communities were also worried about this. And this is where I don't always think it was for the right reason. This is just an example of something you can find a lot of these slides online. They're pretty disturbing. And the idea that zoning will save us from the other. So you look at this diagram and it shows X's next to the quote unquote bad houses that have people we don't want to live near. And this is, at first I thought this was about something else. This is about a zoning plan for St. Louis. So actually, 100 years ago when zoning first came out, there were explicitly zones for different races. That was something that was part of the original zoning pattern. Even before they thought of sort of single-family zoning, they thought about segregating by race. Fortunately, in a rare moment of sort of clarity, the Supreme Court in 1916 basically said you can't do that. Explicitly, at least, you can't do that. And so a lot of the patterns changed then to looking at other ways of separating by race and income. And then, in the 1970s, I think a lot of the activism that was generally looking to change the world, and often in good ways, really glommed onto the idea of the environment. And downzoning areas became a way to be virtuous and to save the environment. And I think there's There is a nexus there. Zoning at its best can help protect the environment, but oftentimes the idea was the more you downzone, the more you've done a favor to the environment. And this really caught on for a long time, all the way through the 1990s. This is why we often refer to zoning as regulatory redlining. It's a way of basically creating segregation by actual government rules, and not explicit ones, because the Supreme Court said you couldn't do that, but to really sort of to do it by other ways. So zoning went from the original idea, which is let's keep the slaughterhouses and the places where people live away from each other, because the slaughterhouses are bad places to live near, and really started separating us as people. And I think that's really unfortunate. There's definitely been some state responses to that in Maine and in other states. We're at a moment now where states are looking at how zoning can fit in with local plans, but also fit in with statewide needs. And it's sort of an exciting time in some ways. You look, for example, and it's not just in Maine, this is in Louisville, Kentucky, which is one of the places that was notorious for segregating both de facto and under zoning. And they've been looking very closely at their zoning and trying to figure out how it fits in with some of their policy goals. So they're looking at the single-family zoning in Louisville, which is a pretty major city, and 75% of the county, which surrounds it, is zoned for single-family residential, and they're trying to figure out what to do about that. We've also thought of that. GPCOG, I was able to work with GPCOG on a similar study of 13 communities in the greater Portland region, and it came out in 2 parts a couple of years ago. It's on their website. And it looked at what Louisville is doing, and it looked very specifically at what's going on in these 13 communities in the greater Portland region. And we started off with the idea of let's look at where multifamily housing is allowed, and isn't just to get some data on that. But as I read the zoning codes, and unfortunately for me, I think I really like reading zoning codes, I sort of quickly realized it's a lot more complicated than that. It may say it allows multifamily housing, but when you look at other things, it's sort of like a death by 1,000 cuts. You can see all these ways in which, although you may be able to put a 2-family home on a lot in theory in a community, it's not really practically possible. They've put other barriers in the way of doing so. These can include relatively straightforward things, such as parking requirements. It can be very large lot sizes and requiring a much larger lot for a duplex than for a single-family home. It can be something sort of that seems pretty benign at first, which is requiring discretionary review, having to get approval to do it, which sounds relatively straightforward, but time and time again we hear that people who are thinking of adding another unit on their building don't want to take the risk of drawing up a lot of plans and spending a lot of money, only to go to the city or town planning board and be told you can't do that. So even that risk keeps it from happening. There were others, but those are the types of things we looked at. And GPCOG's able mapping staff was able to map a lot of the data that we came up with. And this is sort of the overall regional map of where multifamily housing is allowed, isn't allowed, and then more often has different levels of limits. So you'll see as you shade from the darker colors to the lighter colors, you go from places where there are very few limits on doing multifamily housing to where there are some limits, 1 or 2 of these sort of limiting factors, to where there's many limits, which is a majority of the region, and then places where it's simply not allowed, where I think at least I give those places credit for saying what they mean and meaning what they say. We only want single-family homes here. So just to summarize, for this region, these 13 communities, you have about 5% of the land that's zoned, in my opinion, truly for multifamily housing, where you really can look to put a duplex or a triplex or an apartment building, any of those. You then look at 65% of the region that has what I would term many limits. I think it was 4 or more of these factors. So 65% of the land says it allows multifamily housing, but in my opinion, really basically doesn't, unless you really are willing to jump through a lot of hoops and have a lot of extra land and can meet a very specific subset of criteria. It's important to note this work was done before a lot of the zoning changes from LD 2003. I think that a lot of the conversation during the commission for LD 2003 was about some of these limits and what can we do about them. But nonetheless, it does show how much land we have where we're basically artificially tamping down the market and then saying housing is too expensive. And I think this is it's a pretty simple solution. Why do we care about multifamily housing? You know, we're talking about housing, and I actually think single-family homes are fine. Single-family homes on large lots are okay. Single-family homes on small lots are okay. I think there's nothing wrong with single-family housing, and no one suggests that people shouldn't have the ability to buy a single-family home in this region. But multifamily housing provides a lot of opportunities that aren't provided by single-family homes. It allows people to remain in their community if they need a single-level living, say they're elderly or in a wheelchair. It allows people's children who maybe aren't making as much as them to remain in the community they grew up in. So often they have to leave their community, and then if they get lucky, they can afford a home back in the city or town they grew up in. Also, you know, people who are experiencing financial challenges who are already in the community that nowadays may have to leave because they can't make their mortgage payments anymore, they can't pay their tax bills anymore. If they have the flexibility to put a second unit on their building, they may be able to remain in their community. And I think that's a great solution to that kind of situation. So I think there's a lot of reasons to care about these things, and I don't need to repeat other ones to you, and other people have talked about those. But it's important to realize this isn't either or. This isn't single family versus multifamily. No one is saying you should have to build multifamily on your property, but there is something about choice that I think is important, and it's kind of, you know, built into the American character. If it seems like a problem to someone else, it's a problem to a lot of people in Maine. This is some housing data on the greater Portland region from Maine Housing. And at the bottom, you see the sort of relatively flat line, which is what's happened to incomes. They've gone up about 50% since 2001. That sounds great until you look at the blue line, which is what's happened to the housing costs and housing prices, which have gone up 300% in that time. So that gap has gotten wider and wider, and that is a problem for the region. That means fewer and fewer people can afford housing here based on the incomes you're getting here. It's no surprise that telecommuters, people who have assets and are wealthy, or people who earned a lot of money earlier in their life and now come here and maybe are willing to earn a little less money for part of their career, are the ones who are most likely to be able to afford this housing. People who are in this region, have been in this region for a long time, often struggle to stay here. There's nothing really healthy about that gap. I guess I already said that. So in conclusion, you know, I know I've touched on zoning a lot. I do want to touch on a couple other things that I think ChatGPT missed. I think there's a lot of potential for communities to develop affordable housing trusts to help pay for the type of housing they want to see in their community. This is like a piggy bank for housing development. You're not sure what money you're going to put into it, but maybe you have a little bit of unencumbered fund balance at the end of your fiscal year. Maybe you sell a property and you have some extra proceeds. Maybe you have some zoning rules that require some fees in lieu of other things and can be put into this sort of piggy bank to help pay for affordable or market rate housing in your community. Looking at land banks and land trusts, ways of turning around existing underutilized land that's just sort of sitting there neglected for various reasons, and there's been some recent movement at the state level on land banks that I think is really, really exciting. Looking at things like providing loan products, soft second mortgages, subsidized mortgages, loan guarantees, ways that maybe you can help push the market to provide the type of housing you want to see. Looking at rent stabilization, and I think when you hear rent stabilization, you immediately think rent control. And we can have a long debate about that, but there's a huge range of rent stabilization from sort of the strictest rent control you see in places like New York City and in Portland, to some simple stabilization saying people can't have their rent raised by more than a certain amount every year, and that's pretty basic. These are things that I think are worth exploring. Looking at community-based lending, looking at ways to help the mortgage market, help people get access to the loan products they need. And then finally, looking at federal grant and loan programs, using the HOME program, using the low-income housing tax credit program, a number of other federal programs that exist both in urban and rural areas. There's a lot of alphabet soup at the federal level, and seeing as much of that money, which is our taxpayer money, coming back to the region is something I'd love to see communities work on. I see I have 45 seconds left, so I'm right on time. Thank you very much.